in the present day, 2020-2021, it's become more so of an ideology. And within that ideology, you have the extremes of identity politics, where you have hierarchies that are based on identity markers that, for example, if you are white, you can't have a say on race, which I just think is fucking ridiculous. We're all racialized people. And, you know, if we want to find a way to bring unity, we need to be able to talk, and we need to be able to have the uncomfortable conversations. But, you know, there are these hierarchies that you can't even question. You have things like performative activism, where people think, you know, just a 6-slide infographic is going to change the world. Well, I'm sorry to tell you that I don't think that's how it works. And you get to dox people online if you don't agree with them. You get to shame people in the comment sections or in Twitter threads, where binary thinking is encouraged. Again, that pro or anti, black or white, with us or against us. There's just no regard for nuance. And also it always looks like a competition to outwoke the other person, to say, actually, I don't need my voice to be uplifted just because of my skin color. Is what I'm saying of value?
Yes.
And exactly as you're saying, is my business actually a good business? And it just so happens that I'm black, right?
Yes.
Because it's one of those things, again, where I can say that I understand the intention behind it, right?
Yes.
Looking at the people that are most underrepresented and uplifting those people. But then when does it become a little bit or a lot infantilizing? To me, it just ends up being, again, that performative activism almost. But I think they are things that start very much well-intentioned. But a lot of people, myself included, I don't want you to do me any favors because of the color of my skin. I know that I'm very good at what I do. And if I had, let's say, a brick and mortar shop, I want you to be there because my products are actually good and the service is actually good, not because of the color of my skin.
That was Africa Brooke. Wow, I am so excited for this episode today, and I cannot wait for you to listen to her insights, her thoughts, and our conversation. She's an incredibly eloquent speaker. She's vulnerable, she's honest, and it's something I so appreciate. I know I got something from it. It was very impactful for me, and I hope that you gain something meaningful from this conversation too. Africa is from Zimbabwe and resides in Britain. She's a writer, speaker, and consultant. Her work focuses on self-sabotage and self-censorship, which began when she got sober 5 years ago after 7 relapses. In 2016, she became curious about human behavior and the concept of self-sabotage. And after taking from her own subjective experience, she began to look at these things through the lens of the collective, which led to her writing a now viral open letter called Why I'm Leaving the Cult of Wokeness, which has been read by almost 5 million people. I highly recommend you check out Africa's own 2 podcasts called Unfiltered with Africa and Beyond the Self. And if after listening to this episode, you're interested in learning and exploring more of Africa's work, she has a signature workshop on how to stop self-censoring in the age of cancel culture, which you can learn all the details about in her website. I'll link below for you. I wish she lived closer so we could have more of these conversations in person, because I feel like we could be such close friends. So I really hope you enjoyed this conversation, and without further ado, let's get into the episode. Okay, we are here. Welcome back, everyone, to the podcast. I am so excited for this episode. I'm honored to speak with someone that I've grown really inspired by for multiple reasons. Africa Brooke, thank you for being here.
Ellen, thank you so much for inviting me to have a conversation with you. We've been trying to make this happen for a little while, and I always believe that everything happens in its time. And I also don't know exactly what is going to be coming up. I think I say this every time I sit with someone, but it's always true. I have no idea where this is going to go. But just from seeing the conversations that you've had with other people, I just know that it's going to be a very balanced, nuanced approach. So I'm very, very thrilled. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, I resonate so much with the work that you put out into the world. And I often find myself listening to your long Instagram videos while I'm nursing my baby to sleep in the dark with headphones on, and being in the realm of social media myself, where there's lots of room for self-censoring and criticism. I just get really excited about this topic. So I think it's going to be a really fun conversation.
Yes, me too.
So, for those listening today, I just want to say that we're going to be talking about some really relevant topics about culture, about our culture today. And Africa has an amazing transformation story from her evolution and just where she is today, how far you've come. And so, let's just begin.
Yes, yes. So I think the best way to really paint the picture would just to share some of my worldly titles, what I do in the world. So I am a consultant, I'm an accredited coach, and I'm a writer as well. And as a coach and as a consultant, I focus on two main pillars. So the first one is self-sabotage, and the second is self-censorship. And self-sabotage in particular is something that I've been closely looking at and I'm very familiar with. But I've been looking at it in an objective way for the past 5 years. And what led me to even discover what the concept was my journey with sobriety, very specifically getting myself from being a binge drinker, a blackout drinker from the age of 14, and then eventually getting sober in 2016 at the age of 24. And my decision to abstain from alcohol and give myself the life that I actually deserve to live, it wasn't a romantic process. It wasn't, this beautiful decision that I just made one day and I followed through with what I said. It was a very dark and revealing process. I had tried many times to get sober, 7 times consciously. But even in between that, I had promised that I would never drink as much. I had apologized for things that I couldn't remember. I had lost so many people in my life. I had seen so many sides to myself that created so much shame and blame and guilt in the span of a decade. In the most formative years of my life, if you will, from the age of 14 to 24. So that decision, the final decision I made in 2016 to get sober was not pretty. I had to. In order to save my own life, it's something I had to. And something that was different about that time compared to every other time is that I stopped leaning into that shame. I stopped leaning into that blame. I stopped leaning into that guilt, even though it was still there, sort of like an undercurrent. I just started to get curious. What is actually happening to me on a brain-based level when I drink in this way? Why can't I just have one drink? Why am I in this constant destructive cycle? Why, when I stop drinking for a month, I start romanticizing alcohol again and thinking that I will magically just drink differently? Why do I make all of these promises to myself and other people, but I can't keep them? Why do I act like a completely different person when I'm drunk? I just started to ask myself questions, behavior-based questions. And I'm someone that really loves to read. I'm a very curious person naturally anyway. So I just entered a world of psychology, a world of personal development, a world of, and I mean, we have so much access to rich information. You don't even need to leave your room or your home to access some of these things. So I would just listen to different teachers, both ancient and modern. And within that entire process, I mean, it was about 6 months at that time when I was intensely leaning into this new information, but it was keeping me sober, right? And I discovered the concept of self-sabotage, which, to put it very simply, I mean, it's kind of a very layered thing, but it's essentially when you get in your own way, when you don't need someone else to pull the plug, you do it all yourself. Maybe things are going well for a little while, and then you just get the urge to fuck it up. For whatever reason, you just get this urge to go back to what you know, even if what you know is very destructive. You just keep yourself in this cycle. And it was so beautiful because even though it meant I had to meet my shadow, I suddenly had new language for it. So instead of shaming myself back into relapse, I was able to start saying, okay, so this is actually what I'm experiencing. So if I start to look at my own experience in a more objective way, then I can actually change my behavior. And then that opened so many doors. I was invited onto different platforms to share my story, to speak to people that were addicts, to speak to people that had been sober for extended amounts of time, to speak to people that were my age. I was quite young, that were also going through the same thing. And just through me sharing my own story, I then realized that at some point it stopped being about me. And I had to turn this adversity into something else so that I could support other people. That's when I started getting trained in different methodologies, in coaching psychology, working with different mentors. And I just got so immersed in, again, curiosity, but it wasn't about me anymore. I wanted to see how is self-sabotage presenting itself for other people, and what part do things like censorship play in it. And I was speaking about self-censorship in the context of censoring your own life experiences, censoring your own thoughts, censoring the shame that you might have, stopping yourself from saying certain things. It was still through just the individual's behavior. And then I'm going to sort of speed it up so it comes back to the now. And then about 2 years ago, that's when I took the shift from looking at it on a self-sabotage sort of position into what I call collective sabotage. When I started to notice certain things playing out in the culture, which I know we're going to be talking about, I realized, oh my goodness, I've seen this before, just in a different way, but now it's happening on a mass level. So my work has taken me from looking at the individual and now looking at the collective. And I still do both, but that's how it's sort of evolved over time. And it's what brings me here.
That is fascinating, because it's so true. Your experiences kind of help you to just see things in a bigger picture, and it helps shift things a little bit when you look at, well, why am I thinking the way that I do? Why am I doing the things that I do? What's the reason behind it all? And then looking at it from a broader perspective, like, why are so many of us doing the things that we do as a collective? Yes, it's fascinating. And just being in the world of social media, we live a completely different life than we did when, like, we were growing up as children, before Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and all those things, even before YouTube largely took off. And just, it's a completely different world now.
It is. And it feels like it's happened so quickly. It feels like something has really accelerated, especially in the past 5 years. And I think it also contributes to just how because all of this is relatively new at the same time, if you really think about it. So we're forcing ourselves to relate to each other on platforms, on digital platforms that don't really allow for that rich communication to happen, which is what I believe is contributing to what I call collective sabotage, where we're forcing ourselves, our sort of primal selves, to operate in these environments that tend to bring out our shadow. Mostly. It's so fascinating.
Yes, and act in ways that we would never act in real life, and say things that, some people saying things that they would just never say to someone in real life. Like, that's fascinating. And a lot of it has to do with, like, anonymity. Am I saying that word correctly? Hiding behind a screen. It's easier to say something when there's no accountability behind it. And also, I think we're living in a world now where people feel justified to, quote unquote, hold people accountable. Like, that's a thing now, right? Yes. And that kind of plays into the whole topic of wokeness. I think it ties in really well together. I think your story is incredible for so many reasons, because I imagine that maybe 6-7 years ago, you might have never even imagined what your world would look like now, simply from, well, I guess it wasn't a simple process, but from the mind shift within yourself.
Yeah. Every single year that I celebrate my sober birthday, I always feel so humbled by my new reality in such a beautiful way, because what it reminds me, which I think is also very important for this conversation, is the human animal's capacity for change. There was a time when I truly believed that I wasn't going to change. This is just who I am, when that couldn't have been further from the truth. And when I think about the way that people are behaving towards each other today, for example, this idea that some very ignorant statement that you might have made on Twitter 10 years ago is a full representation of who you are today, that you can't be afforded change, not only by yourself, but by the world, right? We're really obsessed with the idea of the unchanged human. And something that always grounds me, and my sobriety always brings me back to even just all of these conversations that seem unrelated, is that I'm astounded just by how much can change, especially when you're aware of that change, which is why I push back against a lot of what I see, because I think the idea that people can't consciously change, I just find it so absurd. And having have lived it myself, and we all have, every single person listening to this you're not the same person you were not even 2 weeks ago, and you probably don't even agree with some things that you said last year.
Totally.
So why can we not afford other people the same grace, right? But yeah, my sobriety always keeps me rooted in that, I think.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. There's a lot of things, like qualities that my husband has, and I'll look at him and be like, wow, I could never be that way. Like, he's just so good at this, and I just don't think like that. But then the more that I shift my mind and the more that I work at it, like, I can change to be towards more like these qualities that I admire within someone else. And it puts you in a victor mentality when you believe in yourself and you know that you can change, as opposed to like a static, this is who I am, there's nothing I can do to change. Complete different. Your outcomes will be completely different.
I agree.
So I wanted to ask you, you wrote this letter why I'm leaving the cult of wokeness. It's an open letter for those of you who haven't read it or heard of it. I'll put the link below in the show notes in the description box, but it's been viewed by 4 million people now. Is that right?
Yes, now nearly 5 million, which blows my entire mind. I mean, for a letter that is, and it's not a short one, Ellen, I'm sure you know, it's not short.
No, but it's amazing, and I recommend everyone go listen to it.
Thank you.
I wanted to read a quote from it so people kind of have an idea of, like, about the topic within it, of what you're getting at, and then I have some questions for you about it. So something you said in here was, I can no longer be an active participant in any culture or movement that encourages groupthink, outrage on demand, fear and violence, revamped segregation, fabricating history, cancellations masked as accountability, self-centeredness, normalization of racism towards white people, the disempowerment of Black people masked as social justice, the constant redefining of existing language, ignoring self-responsibility, constant pathologizing, oppressed versus oppressor mentality, and the pressure to conform and comply. It's exhausting, and honestly, I have better things to do with my time, not to mention it's killing us. So I feel like that kind of helps people know where are you going with this letter, and I recommend you read the entire thing. It's really incredible. But I wanted to ask you, like, what brought you to writing this open letter, and why do you think it's a cult of wokeness?
Right. You know what, anytime someone reads even just a line from that letter back to me, I always get chills, because I'm transported to the exact moment that I was sitting on my couch at 2 a.m. on, I believe it was the last day of December, and then I published it on January the 2nd, 2021. And I remember exactly what I felt. And the main thing that I felt was frustration. But there was also exhilaration along with it, because I felt like I was finally removing probably the heaviest layer of self-censorship that I didn't even realize I had until I sat down and allowed myself to just write, which has always been one of the easiest ways for me to really be honest with my thoughts and what's happening internally, to just write. But it wasn't anything that I had ever publicly spoken about before. I think months before that, I had started to sort of express my frustration in terms of what was happening culturally, just this sort of suffocating environment everywhere you went, where you're supposed to pick a side, where you're either with us or you're against us, where certain questions are just not allowed, But no one ever tells you who's making these decisions. It's almost like a social agreement that you've just opted into. Almost like when you visit a website and then you realize, oh shit, they took my email and they didn't even ask me. And then you just start getting marketing materials. That's kind of like how it felt, mantras that I was just supposed to take on, and ideas that were not supposed to be questioned. And even as I say this, I'm sure someone listening, just from me just saying those pretty vague things for now, you kind of think, yeah, you get what I'm talking about because of how intense all of this stuff is. But I think to really kind of give a more clearer answer, I think it's worth defining woke and wokeness, right? Because I think there are differences. So I was gonna
ask you that. Totally.
Right? Because I think, Helen, sometimes when these conversations happen, everyone has different ideas of what certain words mean. And these are quite loaded terms, especially now.
Yes.
So I always find it so useful when there are just clear definitions. And if you were to ask someone else, they might say something different. But this is the way that I was coming at it from. So the origins of the word woke, originally, it's a term that started from the US, Black America particularly, and it's a very important and meaningful term for Black people in the US. And now it's sort of spread into the Anglosphere. But by definition, it was the state of being aware. So being aware of things like racism and just inequality in general. And, again, a very important and useful term, especially at that time in the 60s and the 70s, 80s, even to the 90s. But like with most things that start with a good intention, somewhere along the line, they do get co-opted by people, sometimes even well-intentioned people that end up taking things way too far, right? And now wokeness itself, in the present day, 2021, it's become more so of an ideology. And within that ideology, you have the extremes of identity politics, where you have hierarchies that are based on identity markers that, for example, if you are white, you can't have a say on race, which I just think is fucking ridiculous. We're all racialized people. And, if we want to find a way to bring unity, we need to be able to talk, and we need to be able to have the uncomfortable conversations. But there are these hierarchies that you can't even question. You have things like performative activism, where people think just a 6-slide infographic is going to change the world. Well, I'm sorry to tell you that I don't think that's how it works. And you get to dox people online if you don't agree with them. You get to shame people in the comment sections or in Twitter threads, where binary thinking is encouraged. Again, that pro or anti, black or white, with us or against us. There's just no regard for nuance. And also it always looks like a competition to outwoke the other person. So because of that environment where wokeness in the present day has become like a religion, like an ideology, and some really wonderful thinkers from all sides of the political spectrum speak about this very, very well. I think it's just worth looking into the sort of parallels that people are laying out to really understand this pretty new phenomenon, if you will. But what that does is that it creates an environment where people are just terrified. It creates an environment where people end up, just feeling that it's much safer to self-censor, because they've seen what happens to others when they ask questions. They've seen what happens when you point out a contradiction. They've seen what happens when you're not, equipped with all of the latest and ever-changing new terminology, and you say something that maybe other people consider outdated, and before you know it, maybe you've lost your job, maybe you're being publicly shamed, you're being misrepresented. It's a very hostile environment. And as we were saying, because a lot of it is taking place digitally, it's really hard to control. There's no center, there's no goal in mind. So all of that taken into account, even as a Black person, which by the tenets of this ideology, I am somewhere up high on the hierarchy, regardless. And it doesn't matter whether my character is good. It doesn't matter what my values actually are. What I actually stand for is just about the color of my skin.
It's just that you're black. It's because you're black. Therefore,
that's it. Yeah. Right? And it's not even a tangent, actually. It's really important for this. Something else that I know is that my letter has been able to reach so many people, as in they've been able to receive my words, and I haven't received any pushback for my letter. It's because I'm black that people are willing to listen, right? Someone else could have said, and people have, very similar things, just looking at it very objectively. But because we're in a time where people have decided that actually you're black, so you get to say this. But I'm not saying the things that I should be saying, right? I'm saying things that actually contradict a lot of these things. So it kind of causes a lot of cognitive dissonance, which just shows you the design of all of this, right?
Right. I mean, also, you're very eloquent and you speak in a way that's very easy for people to grasp and understand where you're coming from. So, yeah, there's that.
Yeah.
let's
there is definitely that. I mean, of course.
Yeah. No, but I fully know what you're saying. I mean, and you and I come from opposite realms of the spectrum of what we're experiencing on social media in realms of topics like this. And my husband really enjoys discourse, and he will do it online, whereas I don't enjoy it online. Like, I want to do it face to face. I want to have a conversation in person, but he doesn't mind doing it online. So there's times when he'll engage, and if someone disagrees with him, I kid you not, I am not joking, every single time they jump to, well, you're just a straight white man. Every single time. No matter, because if they can't argue his points, if they can't argue what he has to say, they jump to what he looks like and his identity, right? Because he's a straight white man. And something he said back before is, could you imagine if I said to you, you wouldn't understand because you're a black man? Like, no, you would never say that. So we've come to this place online that is disgusting to me. And I've actually never, and obviously this isn't everywhere, this isn't always, it's like a certain realm of, there's certain, how do I say it? It's sometimes with some people. It's not always, right? Like, we should be clear, right? But it's gotten really overwhelming to a point where I feel like we're just like not seeing the humanity within people. And I don't agree. I agree with what you're saying, that I don't think that we should only assign weight to someone's opinions based on their identity or based on if they're within the group of the topic we're talking about. Like, for instance, I don't think men can't have an opinion about abortion. Like, to me, that doesn't make sense, because, you know, the argument is that because they're not a woman, because they haven't gone through it. But let's just argue their arguments, as opposed to just saying nothing you say matters because you're a man. Like, to me, that's not interesting to me. It's much more interesting to discuss the position and the arguments and the points than it is to just shut someone down based on their gender, their sex, their identity, and their race.
Yeah. Oh, everything you just said is so important to be heard out loud, because, you know, even when you also say that it's not happening all the time everywhere, that is 100% true. And also, this antisocial behavior, which is what it is spreading like wildfire. And it's important to even refer to it as antisocial behavior, because I think people shut down when they hear, if I had said instead, oh, this woke behavior. And I don't speak in that way, because even though my letter is called Why I'm Leaving the Cult of Wokeness, if someone asks me what is wokeness, I will give you that definition of how I see it as an ideology, but I will also respect its origins, because I'm equipped to hold multiple truths, and I'm also realistic about what it is now. And also because even using that term, people will know what it means. But in discussion, I don't think it's useful to just use woke as a catch-all for everything. I think it's much more useful to use very specific language, and it means that people don't shut down. And it also just drives home what's really happening. So antisocial behavior is what we're seeing. Cyberbullying is what a lot of this is. It's just masked. It's just really wrapped in social justice language. And you have people that can do that very, very well, which is frightening. But then it starts to spread as if this is just the normal way of relating to each other. But it's a very hostile environment. And that's what drove me to write the letter. And the way that I've seen it inspire other people to just start having the conversation, and not even publicly, just privately. Because another disturbing thing about this, Ellen, I don't know if you've seen this in your own life, is that it's not isolated social media or the digital world in terms of how it's affecting people in the real world. People are finding it very challenging to have even the simplest conversations or to just ask a question.
Yes, fully. I mean, because of their experience that they've seen online and what happens when you ask questions, especially with everything that happened in 2020 about BLM and everything. It was so extreme that I think people started to definitely self-censor even in their own lives in real life. And I think it's a really good point that you brought up about wokeness being something originally different and what it's like turned into, because I think you're right. From the beginning, it was a good idea. It's really good to be awake and aware, but like being aware of like, where did it take a turn and what's happening now? Because this obsession that is had online with terms and labels and jumping to conclusions when someone says something that you don't like or that you think isn't exactly perfect. That's what I have a problem with.
Yeah, right. It's the self-righteousness. And actually, I shared something the other day that I would just love to read to you very quickly. It's not long at all. And I think for me, this really summarizes some of what we're saying right now. So what I wrote was, I am not anti-woke. Be as woke as you like. In fact, we need more people to be awake. That can only be a good thing. But what we are seeing collectively today is far from progressive. It's regressive and disturbing. I'm all for people wanting to create a better world. I'm all for people calling out genuine injustice. What I'm not for is extremism in any form, entitlement, denial of reality in favor of an imagined utopia. That's my favorite part.
Yes.
The demands to pick a side and division masked as progress. That's where you lose me. And for me, that just summarizes that I'm not taking a position as being anti-woke. I have no interest in that. I'm interested in the nuance. One of my friends put it very well the other day. He was saying that he's pro-nuance. He's not anything else. He's just pro-nuance. And that's the position that I will willingly, assign myself to, because I just want to find the middle ground again. I think we have forgotten that there is a gray area that we can all step in. We exist in it anyway. So that's what I'm more interested in, and really just putting boundaries and saying, no, I'm not playing whatever game this is. I choose not to play it.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it would be good for us to share personal experiences within this.
Yes.
Because what you said is so good. I've definitely liked that post that you wrote. I probably reshared it.
Yes.
But I have to be honest, I have not gotten into much online expression with this topic in particular because of exactly what we just talked about, because of the identity wrapped up into it and knowing that the way that people receive things. And that's actually one of the reasons why I started the podcast, because I'm a person that loves conversations and words, and I've never found that small Instagram caption limit to be enough to really fully express what I wanted to say and how I felt.
Yes.
Because my goal is for people to just understand where I'm coming from, and I really don't like to be misunderstood. So then as a result, I just self-censored, and I have my YouTube channel where it's like a vlog channel, and I never felt like that was the right space either, where people are looking for these small soundbite entertainment clips, right? A cut like 20 minutes, as opposed to like a long nuanced conversation. And so that's why I started the podcast initially. And that's why I'm like, I'm ready, because I feel confident to talk about these topics that I care about. Like you've seen talked about my earlier episodes. I'm speaking on topics I haven't talked about before, because I'm like, this feels comfortable. I can share how I really feel, and it feels good inside to share how where I'm coming from and to fully express it, you know?
Yes. Oh, I hear you. And this also speaks to actually the platforms in which we're trying to have certain conversations. Because even just when I think of Instagram is the only social media that I have, but it originally started as, and it still is, a visual platform, right? It wasn't really about writing or anything like that. Although now it's more so of a video platform as well. But it's very difficult to, first of all, really get all of the nuance of what you're trying to say and distill it into a caption, as you're saying. But another thing about it is that when you're with someone face to face, you can see their body language. You can gauge their tonality. Delivery is easier to really understand because of all of those other things that are playing a part in that communication process. It's not a fragmented process. It's so whole. There's so much happening. So even when you're with someone that you disagree with on a specific thing, it's much easier to have that exchange when you're face to face. But we're trying to do it in a way that doesn't really work. You know, if you're having a back and forth with someone on a comment section on Instagram, it's not possible to, it doesn't work. It doesn't work, right?
It doesn't.
So I like what you're saying, because this is why I also love podcasts and doing things like Instagram Lives, because it allows me to open so many different doors. It allows me to play around with my tonality and my delivery, and to not try and make it, you know, a 2-minute, get everything in 2 minutes or get everything in 5 minutes. And something that I also do, Ellen, which maybe might be useful to you or someone listening, is that I stay away from anything that is current news-ish. I just won't go there. If I see something that I feel very strongly about, maybe I will share. Or if I see something hilarious, maybe I will share because I love to laugh. But I won't be a social commentator in that sense, because I think that's when it can be very easy to find yourself feeding into this political machine. And I've seen a lot of people ending up stepping into it without even wanting to, but then you get stuck in it and then it becomes a whole thing. So what I do, I think about the bigger picture and the bigger message, which is why I just love the fact that everything I talk about today still ties into the two pillars that I've been looking at for the past 5 years, self-sabotage and self-censorship. Because I think to myself, okay, what is the bigger picture? What am I trying to speak about? Am I trying to speak about division? Am I trying to speak about how we need to humanize one another again? Am I trying to speak about why we need to, you know, cultivate the capacity to hold multiple truths? Am I trying to speak about how we've lost the ability to communicate? So these are things that are still quite broad, but very specific enough. And I think that's much more useful than trying to uncensor yourself so that you can, you know, get some controversial thoughts out without knowing what your ultimate intention with that is, which is why I always say to people, I recommend, if you are going through a conscious process of undoing self-censorship, don't even think about social media. Don't even think about your podcast. Don't even think about putting it out into the public sphere. You need to first get rid of the mob in your own mind. That's not step number one, because we're at a point now, and I'm getting chills as I think about it. We've come to a point where the self-censorship is so deeply ingrained now that we consult the mob in our minds before we even make a decision. And that's wild. So it's not about social media or what you're going to say there. That will be a byproduct of a more silent and intimate process.
Oh my gosh, you made such a good point there. Actually, almost all the time I'm about to post something or I'm writing something and I'm keeping in mind what will, I'm not saying it in those words, like what will the mob say, but it's like, what will someone have to say to criticize this, and how can I word this to be better understood, or just to be less inflammatory and to be, right? Like I do that. I do that all the time, the time. And no, go ahead.
No. I was going to say, I think that's not always necessarily a quote unquote bad thing, because I think there's something useful there. The fact that you're not reactionary, right? You want to actually respond to the action that you want to take, right? So I think you can take something useful from that and say, actually, I should consider the way in which, and I do this also, I should consider how I present this. Maybe this is a prickly topic. What's the best way to approach this? But then you don't want to get sucked into that too much. You also want to take a risk a little bit. It's the risk piece that's also
it's the balance,
right?
It's the balance. Yes. Whereas what you're speaking about earlier is maybe someone who's too afraid to ever say what they really think or what they want to say, if it's even remotely controversial. Right. And I'm so glad you brought up the fact that having an online presence now, the thing about like, should we be talking about real world events or current events? I feel like there's a pressure nowadays. I don't know, maybe if in your realm, but in the realm I'm in, for sure, there's a pressure to speak on any remotely big current event and to publicly talk about it and to publicly say your stance and to publicly vouch for it or be an activist for it. And that could be a wide range of topics. Like I get messages whenever something blows up in the media. And what I find interesting is that there's all different kinds of news stories. There's lots of hurt and troubles and just horrible things happening in the world. But whenever something takes hold on Instagram and they see everyone else they're following posting about it, that's when people start going to like pages like mine and being like, why aren't you talking about this? You need to be talking about this. Why aren't you posting about this, 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 and this? And I mean, there's I can say multiple events, even something as far as like the Australia fires. I'm not in Australia. And when the Australia fires are happening, why aren't you talking about Australia fires and the climate change? Or things like, something that might be more relevant to me is even like, is more relevant to, is the fact that I'm in Hawaii, is things like talking about Mauna Kea and the Hawaiian rights type aspect of things with Mauna Kea. So, and then it came to George Floyd as well. And obviously, and then we can get into that aspect. I think that'll be really interesting for us to share our personal experiences during what happened with like in 2020, because it's obviously going to be quite different. And I think that's really helpful for people to just see how divisive it's become. And when it comes to the world events, like I've always come from a place where I'm not going to be pressured to post about anything I don't feel inclined or passionate to post about.
Yes.
Or if I don't feel well educated on something enough, I'm not going to just speak on it to just be able to say, look, I spoke about it. Look, I care. Like that's not me. I'm going to post what I feel passionate about and what I want to post. Like no one can pressure me to post about something to just feel accepted or to not be like shamed.
Yeah. Yes. And you know what? I love those boundaries because that's what they are. We have created a culture which is so multi-layered, but one of those layers is the idea that the digital world, that you don't really need boundaries, that people can just sort of step into if you think of your Instagram account, for example, your page as your home, that any stranger can step in and just fucking shout at you anytime they want and make a demand, and you're just supposed to do it. That if you put a post out, you have to make sure that you're catering to the sensibilities and triggers and nuanced experiences of 500 million users per day. It doesn't make any sense. So one of the things that I found to be really important is that you have to set the terms of engagement yourself, which is what I've just heard you do, right? I'm not going to be pressured into speaking. I will only speak about what I know about, I think should be the first point, because a lot of people are being forced or feeling as if, their hand has been forced to speak about things they have no idea about. I think one of the most recent ones was when everything was happening in Palestine and Israel, and people were being shouted at for not talking about it, for not saying something. But you do realize that people are on this platform from all corners of the globe. So should someone in Zimbabwe be taught, should they know all of the nuanced details of what's happening in the Middle East? Yes. But that same person could come and shout at everyone online and say, why are you not talking about what's happening in Zimbabwe? There's been an ongoing war in Ethiopia as well.
Yes.
There's something happening everywhere. And
everywhere, all the time.
Right? Something that I always say, Ellen, is that usually those same people that are, waltzing through the streets of Instagram or wherever it is, shouting at everyone, they probably don't even know what's happening in their local community. They probably have no idea what's happening in their local community. Are they supporting the people that live next door to them?
Yeah, but it's because social media told them to care about this one particular thing, and then that means they have to talk about it. And that's not to say, let me be clear, that's not to say that those things don't matter. They do.
Of course.
But what upsets, or not upset, but what is just confusing to me is how easily we jump on this bandwagon of like, this is the only thing that matters right now, and everyone needs to talk about it, even if you don't actually fully know all the details, or you don't have anything of really importance or value to add to the conversation. Not to mention, we're not news outlets, we're not journalists. Like, this is not, don't expect everybody to say things on a topic, or else they're a bigot or they're this or that. Like, that's just unrealistic.
Yeah. Right. And this falls under the performative activism, right? Because it seems like it's just a performance, because what is that actually going to change? And people could obviously argue it's awareness, and I think within context, and if it's done in a consensual way, then yes, I think you're raising awareness in a really powerful, important way. But it's not happening in that way. It's happening through guilting and shaming people and threatening to deplatform people that don't perform on demand. And I think that's it's again, antisocial behavior that is just being normalized and wrapped up in social justice language. And we have to say no. And I'm really glad that you're saying what you're saying, because I think more people should be willing to say, actually, no, I will do things as I need to. And it's also unethical to just pass around information that could possibly be untrue.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And not to mention that there's so much nuance to so many of these big world events too. It's not as black and white as social media wants to make it seem. Not always, but a lot of times. So how about we get into specifically what happened during George Floyd BLM with your personal experience and mine, because I think that would be really fascinating. Do you want to go first or should I? How about you go?
I'd like you to, actually.
Oh, me? Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. You know why I said that? Because usually when I speak to people about 2020, especially in an exchange like this one, they're usually asking me what my experience was. And I think you normally get to hear from, for example, Black people, because it would sort of make sense to want to ask the Black people, oh, so what did you experience? And of course, the high emotions that people felt, especially last year, and the way that it sort of ended by the end of the year, that level of polarization, which I don't think we've ever really seen as of late, it felt as though, and I mean, I've spoken to so many people at this point in time, thousands, it felt as though, and people were being told that if you're white, you shouldn't feel anything. It's so bizarre that you shouldn't feel upset or confused,
or even you're not allowed to have an experience. Even just me saying I had an experience is like, you're deflecting from the problem. You're trying to make it about you, and this is not about you. And I fully get that, but I am
so much meaning is applied to just you saying, hey, I have an experience of this.
Yeah. Yes, but like, I am not afraid to just say, this is how I feel. This is what I experienced. Especially, I feel comfortable, like I said, because I'm on this podcast platform where we're having just a full conversation. Whereas I have never actually done an Instagram post about this ever. So why is that? And it's because, like we said earlier, there just isn't enough room for nuance and discussion on an Instagram post.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
It does make sense. So I think that's why I'm really curious to hear what your experience of it was.
Okay. So everything happened with George Floyd, and obviously what happened was horrendous and horrible. And actually, I don't even know a single person who would defend what happened to George Floyd as okay. No one. I had just given birth to my fourth baby a couple weeks ago, I think. And so I was in like babyland in my own home. Every once in a while, getting online something, my husband mentioned something about George Floyd and stuff, and just learning about what happened. And rarely online myself, though. And then I slowly see this incoming of comments coming on my latest picture of my baby Koufax. Hundreds of comments like starting to come in saying, why aren't you talking about George Floyd? Why aren't you talking about BLM? Why haven't you done a black square? You're a white supremacist. You're a neo-Nazi. You're all these things when I hadn't said a single thing. I hadn't said anything. And it was because I hadn't said anything. It had been probably like 6-7 days now after the fact. And everyone's posting, like everyone is posting about George Floyd and BLM every single day. It's really the only thing that was online that I was seeing. It was the only thing. And if you posted something that wasn't that, it was like, what are you doing? You know? So I just like decided to just take a step back and just not post anything, just looking, observing type of thing. But seeing it just slowly come in by the hundreds, thousands like that, and the arguments on this post of my baby, I'm like, wow. I don't know if I ever want to post a picture of my children ever again. Like that just made me like, and also I understand what like maybe people listening is going, this isn't about you. Stop making this about you. This is not what I'm saying. I'm not trying to make it about me at all. It was more just my experience on how I chose to respond. Yeah. And I don't have the typical viewpoints of what maybe they wanted me to post. Like, and maybe they hadn't even considered that there was another idea around what was happening. Not to say, right, like, I don't even know how to word this totally, like, in the best way, but I'm not saying that what happened to him was right. Of course not. Like, police brutality in any form, I'm against that completely. It's what came after that with all of the hashtags and all of the just everything that happened. I don't even know how much I should get into it, but I just don't hold the same type of mentality about like for instance, well, anyways, someone online, I guess a lot of people were starting to go to other vegan influencers who were black and saying like, you need to put Ellen in line. She's not saying anything. You need to get her, put her straight because she's not talking about this. She's not saying hashtag BLM. And then one of them came to me and was like, hey, someone said you weren't posting anything. And I was like, she isn't? I kind of like that. Because he was like, everyone is. I'm not, because I don't hold the same type of perspective that people would typically. And so it was refreshing to see maybe you're not sharing this like regurgitated what everyone's telling you to do, as opposed to like just thinking critically. So I ended up posting like, my husband's like, Aunt Ellen, don't say anything. But I was like, I'm gonna just like make it clear so people know like, obviously, I don't agree with what happened to him because it was just nothing had been so blown up, right? Compared to this. Out of all the other news stories I had mentioned, this was the biggest that had ever happened. So I like put it on my stories like, I just want to make it clear, like, however long it's been. Like, of course, what happened to him was wrong and horrible and should never happen. Police brutality is wrong and evil, completely against that. And then I just shared something after like, I also think it's important to listen to like all different voices and to not just like assume there's like a monolith of like exactly one idea. And I have a friend who was like interested in having her opinions shared, but she doesn't have a big platform. But she was also a little bit nervous for me to maybe be like, go follow this person, because she knows of kind of like the backlash you could get for sharing a different opinion as a black woman. And so she's like, just have them DM you if they're interested, and then you can send a DM to the person. But we did that, but that was really hard for me to like keep up with like sending people. Anyway, so that was the gist of my story. And then people go, oh, I can't believe she would say that there's a different opinion to this. There's one opinion. She's this or that. Just like a flood of, you're a neo-Nazi, a white supremacist, you're a bigot, blah, blah, blah. So that was basically what happened.
I'm so sorry you experienced that.
Oh, it's okay. I don't feel any kind of, well, I just don't.
I understand what
you know what I'm saying?
I understand what you mean. But it's also important for me to say it's not okay, because I hear so many stories like that, especially about everything that people experienced in 2020. And not just white people, but from black people as well, from brown people, from people that really wanted to take the time to understand the situation instead of looking at a headline, from people that acknowledged just how vile what had happened to him was, but how there were also other things that we weren't aware of that were being shown, just a very short story of a much, 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 much more layered situation. But again, that wasn't welcome. And those people, some people even had their entire livelihoods destroyed just because they didn't echo, right? Just because they didn't echo what they were told they were supposed to. And another thing that's really disturbing about this is that some of the people that maybe, joined in on your cancellation campaign, if you will, if you were to walk past them in the street, you wouldn't even know who the person is. And I emphasize that because it's strangers that have this much of a hold. So it's important for me to say actually that it's not normal behavior. It's not okay. We've normalized it. And because you're white, I'm supposed to say, oh, yeah, that's just how it is.
Yeah, and if you care about it, then you're just what is it? You're just showing your white fragility and your sensitive. Yeah, but really, I was just seeing so many things online happening that made zero sense to me. The obsession with oh man, where do I even begin? The obsession with saying you need to say something, but then if you said something, you didn't say that right, or if you need to listen to Black people, and then if you say, okay, I'm here listening, share what you want. How dare you make us do the work and tell you what you think? Like too many things just contradicted each other and didn't make any sense.
There you go. And
yeah.
No,
and I think,
go.
Okay, so the last thing I want to say before you go into yours is that the main core thing for me is that not all Black people feel like they're oppressed. And this whole monolith that like Black people are oppressed, white people are the oppressor, Black people can't get ahead in life, and they can't get to where they want in life because they're Black. Not every Black person thinks that way. So why is this the norm, and why do you have to say that or else you're a bigot? That does not make sense to me. And I think so many people just weren't considering that. And also, if somebody was saying, hey, I don't feel oppressed, I'm not oppressed, I'm Black and I don't feel oppressed, they say, oh, well, you're internalized racism. Like none of that makes sense to me. None of that makes sense to me. So for me, there was like such a lack of critical thinking, and that's where I was coming from. And so people didn't like that.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It is so refreshing just to hear someone, especially someone who is in the public eye like you are, being willing to just say what they experienced. You're not giving, a kind of abstract opinion on something hypothetical. This is just something that happened in the summer of 2020. Hey, right? But the fact that, again, because of these identity markers, we have decided who can share their experience and who can't. But at the same time, we seem to value lived experience, but only the lived experience of those that toe the line and say what we say and follow this very particular script. So it's just so many contradictions. And I saw everything that you just said in terms of what happened to you and what you observed is what I was seeing myself, but just in a very different way. So I am in the UK, and I am an immigrant from Zimbabwe, came to the UK at the age of 9 from Africa, and I'm now 29, so I've lived most of my life here, but I'm not in the US. And here in the UK, even though we have, of course, there's so much history that we could get into, but we won't, in terms of the part the UK has played, in colonizing and the race conversations that have been had here as well. But it's very different to America. It's not the same at all. But in the summer of 2020, when everything happened with George Floyd, and I think something had happened with, I'm not able to remember the name, maybe Jacob Blake, I think. There was this idea that we are just supposed to take on everything that is happening in the US as if it's also what's happening here in the UK. That you can't point out just how different our experiences of race are, that you just have to look at the color of your skin, and you have to look at this very big story that is happening in another country, and you have to take it on as your own. And I did. And I briefly fell into that. And again, we have fully acknowledged that what happened should not have happened, regardless of what his history was, what his criminal record was, etc., it doesn't justify the way that he was taken. It just doesn't.
Absolutely.
Right? And it was such a highly emotional time. And I think also lockdown played a part in this.
Yeah.
Because I think if people weren't in their homes, on their phones, 24/7 in the way that we were, I think things would have looked a little bit different. So I'd be curious to see in the years to come the kind of research and studies that are done on how the lockdown has influenced some of the biggest shifts in our culture. But it was a highly emotional time, and we were being sold this idea that Black people in America, but it could be anywhere you are in the world, are being hounded in the streets, and that the common enemy is any white person. Any white person, that is the common enemy. That there are only two sides. You're either the oppressor, and to be the oppressor, the minimum is that you're white, and that's it. You're assigned that role. And to be oppressed, the very minimum is that you're a Black person, and that is your assigned role. But I never bought into that. That's when I felt myself thinking, I don't buy into this, but why do I feel scared to say that I don't buy into this? Like, I don't think all white people are my oppressor, because I'd have to think I'm oppressed to think there's an oppressor. I've never felt oppressed in my entire life. The color of my skin is not a burden. Have I experienced elements of racism? Yes, especially in my childhood. But some of the rejection that I have experienced because of my Blackness has been from other Black people. So that's another element of my race and my experience. And it looks different from person to person. So again, all of these different questions and kind of, wait, this doesn't apply to me. I felt like I couldn't say it. And I'm a very confident and outspoken person, and I've always been. But it felt like there was this no-go area. But it's not as if someone told me that I can't talk about it. It's like a societal decision that has been made on my behalf. And that was just one of the moments where the veneer started to crack for me. And when I started to see the level of dehumanization, where people's, again, the exact same thing that happened to you, people's comment sections and their photos being swarmed, people pretty much, the mob just knocking on your door saying, why haven't you shared this very specific thing that I think is important? Why are you not chanting this exact same message? Why are you not condemning yourself because of your race? Because a lot of white people were being told to apologize, or you need to apologize to any Black friends you have. But I am a Black friend to many people, but I was thinking, but I don't want my friends to apologize to me for having power over me. It was just so strange.
Right.
So as much as I was experiencing that unity with other Black people and in mourning, which I thought was actually important and still do, there was also another side of me that was thinking, okay, but now this is going into the extreme, and it's going into a very, very dark place. But I felt that I'm betraying the movement if I say something about this. But then the self-censorship just got very, very strong, and I started to see it in other areas. It wasn't just about race anymore. It was anywhere we can find the division, let's find it. That's the game that started to get created. And again, that's what added to me ending up writing that letter. But it's just so interesting and refreshing to hear your side of it, because I saw that happen from the outside, and I was being told that I'm supposed to be okay with that.
Yeah, I think because it was so bombarding, it was everywhere. And so it's intimidating,
Yeah.
Like I consider myself a very confident, outspoken person as well. But in that moment, I'm like, I'm going to not say anything. I'm going to just,
Right.
I'm going to make it clear, like my stance on like police brutality, obviously. And then I'm done, because
Yeah.
I saw so many people apologizing when it felt not genuine, and people just attacking other people. It just got to such a crazy place, like so many layered things as well. Even what are your thoughts on like things like the whole uplift Black voices thing? Because I saw over and over, like, these are Black businesses to support, and like saying, and I find that such an interesting conversation, because like let's just say devil's advocate here, like, couldn't that be considered like, why that means I'm only being supported because I'm Black. My business is successful because I'm Black, as opposed to because it's a good business.
Right.
Like,
And you know
feels...
what? These are conversations that are actually, and I think this is such a good thing. These are conversations that have been happening, I think, since everyone sort of stepped out of the haze that was 2020, and people generally did start to think, okay, maybe this went a little bit too far, and started to review their own behavior and just some of the things that were happening. These are some of the conversations that are starting to happen. Well, where I am, at least, in the UK, just amongst Black people generally, to say, actually, I don't need my voice to be uplifted just because of my skin color. Is what I'm saying of value?
Yes.
And exactly as you're saying, is my business actually a good business? And it just so happens that I'm Black, right?
Yes.
Because it's one of those things, again, where I can say that I understand the intention behind it, right?
Yes.
Looking at the people that are most underrepresented and uplifting those people. But then when does it become a little bit or a lot infantilizing? As if you're sort of just saying, oh, just give them something, you know. Let's just, you're not that great, but we just need this to die down. To me, it just ends up being, again, that performative activism almost, which doesn't seem to have a very specific goal. But I think they are things that start very much well-intentioned. But a lot of people, myself included, I don't want you to do me any favors because of the color of my skin. I know that I'm very good at what I do. And if I had, let's say, a brick and mortar shop, I want you to be there because my products are actually good and the service is actually good, not because of the color of my skin. So I think what we saw in 2020, you had a lot of people, including corporations, sort of scrambling to prove that they're not racist, or kind of scrambling to prove that social justice is a big value for them. And in that process, they end up infantilizing the very people they're trying to represent. And I think a lot of people bought into it at the time, and maybe still do because you still see it. But I think now more people realize that actually it's not really doing them many favors in terms of the long term. So I think it's definitely a worthy conversation. Yes,
because I understand, like what you're saying, I understand the intentions behind it of uplifting a certain community and stuff. But you end up painting an entire group of people as a certain way, as right, needing to be helped, and it's like a soft bigotry of low expectations.
That's it. That's exactly it.
And I think some people just aren't considering that. That's why the nuance and the conversation is so important. And that's why we're talking about this, because we've heard all the other perspectives here. Like, we've all heard it. But like, let's hear this as well. That could be given a little bit more light. It helps find a nuance and a balance, you know?
I agree. Yeah.
Okay. I feel like for me, a personal experience of like what you said, how people will assume maybe you want to be treated a certain way, or that maybe you feel oppressed when you don't. I've gotten that too about like being a woman, like people saying, well, don't you want people to acknowledge that like you're suffering, or that you haven't been able to get as far ahead because you're a woman? And my honest opinion is that I've never felt oppressed as a woman. I've never felt like I was less than or couldn't get as far ahead as a woman. If anything, it's the opposite. If anything, our today's culture, I feel like it's easier as a woman. But that's just my personal experience, obviously. Not everybody's going to have that experience, but yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, I love this conversation, and I'm actually so excited to listen back, because this is one of the things that I put very briefly in my open letter, but it was specifically referring to why I don't call myself a feminist. I mean, I do have values that can align with feminism, but probably not whatever this version of feminism is that we have today in 2021. But it's not a label that I use for myself. It's not a label that I need. Culturally, as a Zimbabwean person, it's just not in our language, right? But through actions, we do want equality between the sexes, between the genders. Women are upheld. And just like you, I never grew up thinking my girlhood or my womanhood is a burden. Am I aware of the things that happen to women all over the world? Absolutely. And in fact, I would feel as if I'm slapping the women that are truly oppressed in the face for me to sit here in the Western world and say that I'm oppressed. I really would, because I'm aware of what true oppression looks like. Something that I really advocate for is survivors that have experienced FGM, which is female genital mutilation, which is a practice that happens quite a lot in Africa, also Asia, also here in the UK as well a little bit. But I know what oppression actually looks like. And because from what I see is that there seems to be this sort of, you're put on a pedestal the more victimized that you are. And there's a culture of just keeping people terrified. And I think it's keeping women so scared when they're constantly told that you being a woman, you're always going to have it less, that you should always, look out and see where there's a gender pay gap or where there's a gap somewhere that you're not fitting into, or a way that you're disadvantaged, etc. And it's just creating another layer of that culture of keeping people so terrified and just in constant victimhood. And I say that not to say that women are not experiencing really things that we couldn't possibly imagine, but we also need to be willing to hear the women that say, actually, I'm a woman and I don't feel oppressed. There is that side to our experience as well. But for whatever reason, it seems as if you can't even say that, because it means something. It's like you're denying, or it's misogynistic in some strange way. It's so bizarre.
You hit the nail on the head so amazingly there, because it is true. There are women that are truly suffering and are truly being oppressed across the world. And it does feel like a disservice to just say that I'm oppressed. And also, I think whatever you think you see, that will be your reality. What you say to yourself, especially in the Western world where we do have equal rights and we do have the privileges that we do today, that if you are constantly being told you're oppressed, whether it be because you're a woman or because of the color of your skin or because of your gender identity, the more that you say it, the more that you will see it, even in places that it doesn't exist.
Yes.
And that's not saying that you won't have certain experiences that could define that, but if you let it define you, that's where it shifts how you put out your life into the world and how you feel inside. So that's not to say that I've never experienced, like I have experienced like certain things because I'm a woman, or the way that I look, right? Like in the workplace, back when I was a waitress, like things like that. But how that defines me is where you move forward. Like if that defines me or not,
right?
Right.
Yeah. Oh, that's so. You've put that so beautifully, because when people really decide that they're going to tune into selective hearing, which is what I see in kind of this wokeness ideology, if you will, that you can say something, even just as you said, so specifically and so intentionally, and people will just filter through that and take different words together and put them together and say, oh, so this is what you're trying to say.
I know. And that's why it's so difficult. That's why it is difficult to put yourself online like this.
Yeah.
And that's why your work is so fascinating, because you're helping teach people to come into their own power and speak where they're really coming from. That's why it's so powerful. And also, we should actually get into about how important the collective is. That's where you're coming from, and how, right? Do you want to explain a little bit how about the work that you do is like largely about the collective?
Yes, absolutely. So I mentioned before that the origins of my work is just really understanding self-sabotage. So as the term would suggest, it's really about the individual. How can you look at your own behavior? How is your behavior impacting the results that you actually start to get? How is your internal world influencing the way you think and the actions that you take or don't take, etc.? But now it's evolved into me just wanting to understand collectively, what are we doing right now? And something that I come back to is personal responsibility I don't know if this is something you would have spoken about when you spoke to Zubi, but personal responsibility is something that seems to be demonized currently. People seem to think it's synonymous with victim blaming almost, which is another term that has become, kind of taken people's fancy. But when I think of collective sabotage, I just see it as a group of individuals that instead of taking personal responsibility and looking at what they can control and looking at how they can shift their own behavior so they can start to get their desired results, where they learn how to sit with their own discomfort, they don't do any of that. They just think, this is what is happening to me right now. It's uncomfortable and I'm experiencing something I don't like. So therefore, something outside of me is the problem. I don't have to look at any of that. The system is the problem. And here's the thing, because I know some people will try to fill in the gaps here, but I acknowledge the systems that we live under. I wrote this in my letter. I'm able to hold multiple truths. I can acknowledge that there are systems that need to change. And at the same time, as an individual, there are things that are within your control, right?
Yes.
And for you to be able to tune into that, you have to take responsibility for them. You have to take accountability for some of those things. You have to make different decisions. So with that being said, we're now starting to see that it's become sort of like a social norm to project any discomfort that you're feeling internally. So why I call it collective sabotage is that it's no longer just about the individual that we have to be concerned about. We now have groups of these people that find each other and sort of just project all of their internal discomfort or their dissatisfaction with the world, and this kind of their chase for a utopia that will never exist. And then it becomes everyone else's problem and they don't have to look at it. And because of social media and the digital world, it's becoming much easier for those groups to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger in a way they never would in the real world, if you will. So that's what I'm fascinated with. That's the area that I tend to focus on the most. I mentioned earlier the mob in the mind. I think it's a part of that as well. But it's just starting to think of what is the psychology of when people come together in this really destructive way, but they say that they want a productive outcome, but you can tell by their behavior that they're never going to get that outcome. So that's kind of it's a little bit abstract, but that's how I see collective sabotage playing out.
Yeah, and I see what you're saying is that online, especially when we do this thing that like you're either with us or against us, you either have all the answers or none of them, you're good or you're bad, black, white, all these things. We put ourselves in a place that doesn't actually hear all different perspectives.
Yes.
And we get farther and farther in an echo chamber, and we become so divisive and so separated and less communal, as I think would do so much better for our society. That's not saying we have to be like dystopian,
of course,
right? But just trying to understand where we're coming from, and if we could become more as a collective, just willing to hear each other out and willing to not quickly blame someone or shame them or name them this or that if they disagree with you on this or that, then we're more likely to just understand each other where we're coming from. You don't even have to agree.
Right.
But just understand, I get why you got there. I get why you think that and how you got there.
Yes.
Like that's so beautiful. It reminds me of a topic that I ended up talking about online. I did like a single post. I was feeling very convicted. Like I really wanted people to know this is where I stand, but in a very like calm, like simple way. Was I did a post just basically sharing about basic biological facts of baby in the womb and sharing that babies have inherent value, just the biological facts of babies in the womb at different time frames. And I was pregnant with Kovacs at the time. And at the end I said that babies in the womb have inherent value and the difference between us and them is time. And that's what I said. Nothing else. But that blew up. I mean, I knew it would happen, right? It's such a controversial topic. And it's obviously, I knew that would happen to a level, but it's so interesting how quickly something as simple as that can draw so much anger and so much good, bad, wrong, right, you're this, if we disagree on a specific topic, right? That's so layered.
Right. Oh my goodness. Even, you know what, as you were explaining the post that you wrote, I was thinking, oh, that's so interesting. As in, this is something that I would really engage with, regardless of where I quote unquote stand. Just the fact that someone is offering me this perspective, and that the only difference is time, I would find that just generally quite interesting. And then what would happen? I would see it, and then I would just move on with my life. I would just move on with my life. But it's almost as if that thought doesn't occur to a lot of people, that if I see something and I like it, I can engage with it, and then I like it, and then I get to move on. If I see something and I don't like it, I get to see it. Okay, this is not for me, and I get to move on. We think, again, that collective behavior, that collective antisocial behavior, we think that if I see this and I feel uncomfortable and I filter it through my own subjective experience, my own values, my belief system, and I don't like it, I feel discomfort in my body, then it's Ellen's fault. Then she is a bad person. She has done something wrong. She has to delete this for my comfort and the comfort of all of the thousands of people that will see this.
Yeah.
And it's not normal.
And I think it's also comes from a place of feeling like a justice place. Like this is, we need to get the truth, like what they believe to be the truth, or what they believe to be progressive and helpful. And so it comes from a place of feeling justified in the name of justice, right?
God, dehumanizing in the name of justice. Isn't that wonderful?
Yes. And I'm like, hey, if I was in person with you, I would love this conversation. Like, let's just talk about it and go back and forth. And anyone who knows me on a personal level knows that I love conversations with different people, different perspectives. Right. But in person, it's just difficult. Online is just such a crazy place. I think about young people and how hard it must be for their developing brains.
Yes. You know what? That's a piece that I'm really curious about, actually. And I started thinking about this a few months ago, that it's wonderful that I am having these conversations with adults, whether they agree with me or disagree with me. Agreement is not the goal. Disagreement is not the goal. Conversation is the goal. But then I was thinking there are so many young people that are growing up in this environment and thinking this is just normal behavior, and thinking that censoring themselves, maybe they won't even come to a day of thinking, I think I'm censoring myself, because it's just the default. It's just normal that you don't say what you actually think. You agree with whatever the majority says. You can't be curious, or you can only be curious in this context, but not in this one. It's making me realize that it's actually young people that really need this conversation the most. So I do think that in the next year or so, that will be my aim, to just actually go into schools and universities and continue these conversations, because I think they shouldn't be, number one, isolated to the digital space, even though it's becoming the space in which we occupy the most, which is a little bit scary. But I think it also needs to happen with young people, so they can learn how to relate to one another, especially when they disagree.
Yes. I mean, it should actually be like a core unit class, I feel like.
Right. Yeah.
Yes. This makes me think of your self-censorship event that you recently had, of like the work that you're doing to help people. Can you talk a little bit about that? And can people still access that if they're looking to like stop self-censoring and just become more in their power to say how they really feel?
Absolutely. So I did it for the first time a couple of months ago, and it's how to stop self-censoring in the age of cancel culture. And it was wonderful. And the purpose of this event, which I will be running again in January 2022, or maybe if you're listening to this in the future, it should be available by then, just as a standalone course on my website. But the purpose of this was to give people the how. And what I mean by that is, through these conversations and the work that I do, and just exploring what self-censorship is, what cancel culture is, what dehumanizing looks like, etc., we can get stuck in the why. We can get stuck in sort of unraveling, and then in the theory, and then in, intellectualizing it. But for a lot of people, they just want to know, how do I actually integrate this into the real world? What does a practical approach to undoing self-censorship actually look like? If something happens in my workplace and I feel compelled to say something, what action do I take then? What level of risk should I be willing to take? So these are questions that I just post to people, but I also offer some suggestions as a consultant, of course, because I think now we just need the how. I think people are terrified, so much so that they don't even know where to begin. And a lot of people end up getting stuck in the why, which I do think is important, because you need the information, you need the language to make sense of what you're feeling, what's happening in the world. But more than ever, I think we just need sustainable, practical ways to actually move out of this on an individual and personal level. And that's the work that I do with individuals and groups. So I'll be doing this again in January 2022.
Oh, perfect. So can people purchase it like already done, or is it just the live purchase?
So at the moment, the next one is going to be live, because there's something just about doing it live, because I like to do it in a very interactive way where people can ask any questions they have. But by the spring 2022, it should be a standalone course as well, so you can take yourself through it. But I'm trying to find a way of doing that in a way where it just doesn't become another course that you buy, but you actually can't integrate the learning. So I'm taking a bit of time with that to see what people actually need, instead of just putting something out there for the sake of it. But it will be there. And in the meantime, so cool. In a way, people can always engage with my work. I always try to make it as practical as possible without you needing to pay for anything. I think totally. It should be accessible. Yeah.
Oh yeah. You share so much amazing stuff on your Instagram. Everybody needs to go follow you. I will be talking about you in an intro before this episode, so they'll be able to hear and learn a bit more about you. And I think when you talk about self-censorship, it's for people to realize it's not just for people who are on social media. Like this happens like in your real life. There's a lot of people who are afraid or have anxiety to discuss with other people in their lives their real thoughts about something if they think the person they're talking with disagrees with them. Yes, right? And just really being able to just say, hey, this is really where I'm coming from, without being afraid of being judged or labeled, and just being able to hear each other's perspectives without having the anxiety go through the roof. Right?
Yes. Oh, I love that. I love that. And you know what I think will be useful for even both of us or anyone listening is to just make the distinction between self-censoring and having a social filter. This is really important, okay?
Yes.
So, right, I'll start with the social filter. And just by me laying this out, I think it will offer just clarity, and I think it can also give you a bit of relief. What I mean by that, and what it looks like, is a social filter is something that we have anyway intrinsically, right? When you're with a certain group of people, you just approach the way you converse differently. There are things that you know are not appropriate to say in certain situations, because you use your self-awareness to really gauge the context of the situation. Is this going to be useful? Is this not going to be useful? And a really light-hearted example that I can think of, is, let's say you meet up with your aunt and she's wearing, kind of an ugly jumper, right? But it's your aunt. You don't tell her that. It's not useful. It's not useful information to her. What do? You keep that to yourself. You keep that to yourself because it's inappropriate. It's not going to be useful. It will probably tarnish the relationship or just make things awkward. And it's just generally not nice, right? In that moment, are you censoring yourself, or are you using a useful social filter? Yes. You're probably using a useful social filter, right? Especially if it's not coming from a fear-based place. But the difference with self-censorship, it's always fear-based. You think that you're going to be punished. You think that you're going to be ostracized. You think you're going to be abandoned or rejected, or the term that we all know and love, cancelled. So it's visceral, and it's physical, and it's emotional, and it's mental. And it doesn't feel as if you're making an informed decision from a grounded place, like the jumper example that I've just given you. So a social filter is very useful. It's something that we all have anyway. Another very quick example that I can use is that I love to swear, but if I'm around kids or if I'm around my mum, it's just, I won't do it. I won't do it because to me it's inappropriate and it's not useful. It's not going to add anything. It doesn't give me that same zing of excitement as if, it's just different. That's my social filter. That's not me censoring myself. And also the process of undoing self-censorship doesn't mean that you just say whatever you want to say and there aren't any consequences. There are always consequences for your speech. And I think that is a good thing. Right? That is a good thing. We can get into a deep discussion of who decides what's good or bad, etc., etc. But I think there are just general sort of social agreements that we all have that we can say, yeah, that's a good thing. But I think it's about aiming for mindful expression, even when you're uncomfortable, even when things are a little bit difficult, because self-censorship is always from a fear-based place. So I would say to kind of practice looking at, am I censoring myself here, or am I just being tactful and using my social filter?
Yeah, I think that that's a really important distinction to make.
Yeah.
And it also reminds me of like intellectual diversity that you're talking about. Like there's a difference between the social, like, hey, I don't need to talk about my, say my aunt's sweater isn't nice, but like intellectual diversity within a topic that's layered and deep and really meaningful, like to say how you really feel. And there's something you said where you said, I want to repeat what you said in a post that you did, which I thought was amazing. You said, true diversity and inclusion doesn't and shouldn't stop at skin color, gender, or sexuality. It has to include intellectual and viewpoint diversity. Otherwise, it's simply a performance. And I loved that. So how do you respond to somebody who says like, well, some ideas are dangerous and like, we need to draw the line somewhere, right? Like some ideas can be really harmful. So how would you respond to that type of question about what you've said?
Right. And that's a common one, actually. Not one that I get all the time, but it just depends on what I'm talking about. But I see it being a question that's sort of thrown out to anyone that advocates for the open exchange of ideas. So my answer to that would be, and I'm sure I've written about this, but of course, there are a lot of ideas that are really not great ideas. There are some very extreme ideas. There are ideas that I think can influence dangerous behavior. But whether or not they are out there or they are repressed, they exist, right? Is it not better to hear all of the ideas? And hearing does not mean agreement. I think that part is really important. And I like to emphasize that part because I think it disarms people. Because of the binary thinking, people will often assume that by saying let's hear ideas, it means let's take on all of these ideas and let's action them. No, but it means let's just bring these ideas out of the shadows so we can decide as a society or as individuals or as a couple within whatever conversational context. So we can decide what is useful and what is not useful. Because whether you like it or not, those ideas exist and you can shield yourself from them all you like, but it doesn't mean they will go anywhere. Actually, they do go somewhere. They usually go into the shadows where they get even more disturbing, where they get even more sinister. So I think we need to be able to cultivate our ability to hold discomfort, to be able to hear things that we don't like, to be able to hear things that we disagree with, but to be able to work with that and say, actually, I don't agree with that because, and to be able to work together as a society so we can get good ideas. Because if we're shutting everything down, that probably means that we're shutting down a lot of good ideas because they don't seem like something that we immediately understand. So hopefully that makes sense. But I think either way, they exist. And I think it's much better to shine a light on them than to shun them into darkness.
I fully agree, because when these really, truly dangerous ideas get brought to light, it's very clear to people and it makes it harder for them to thrive.
Yes.
I think. But then I also see how quickly the woke, if you will, right, will jump down and label something as dangerous because they don't like what that person said. But that doesn't mean it actually was dangerous. And that's why critical thinking comes into play. So like anyone listening to this that maybe heard things that they're like, I don't agree with this, or I can't believe that Ellen said this, or whatever, like go and listen to this another opinion and then really gauge what makes the most logical sense to you, not to what you're told to think, like critically think.
Yeah, I love that because it's a reminder for anyone listening, to be honest, not just to us, but if you listen to anyone else having similar conversations, that it's not about agreeing and it's not about searching for disagreement so you can say, aha, see, I knew. It's about just taking in the information and, as I always say, just filtering it through your own self-awareness and then coming to an informed opinion and just watching at whether you're actually responding to something or whether you're just waiting for an opportunity to react.
Oh,
and
that's
I think
so
at
good.
the moment,
yes,
right? And people at the moment, we're being set up to just wait for the moment where we can react and sort of get this righteous reward, which doesn't really last for long. But I think it's much more sustainable to just sit with the idea of potential discomfort and then make an informed decision about how you're going to proceed with the information you've just received.
Yes, on a personal level, not even necessarily
Yeah.
having to like say, look, you're wrong because of this or that.
Exactly.
Like you said, like, I actually really appreciate how in a lot of your posts you say, hey, and if you don't like what I have to say here, feel free to move on. You do not have to engage and make it a thing. I love that.
I love the way you just said that. You just made me sound really lighthearted and like, hey, you can. Usually I'm much firmer than that. I'm like, you can piss off if you don't like it.
Yeah, the way that I'm receiving it is you're like, hey, feel free, and you're like, no.
I love that. No, I'm very, very compassionate. I'm a very compassionate and soft person, but I'm also very firm. And I love that can be felt through my words. But again, I think you do have to set boundaries. It makes such a big difference, even if it's just writing a line, or just saying what you won't tolerate. You will have some people that will drop off, but I promise you, if you are someone that shares something online, or even if you don't have a quote unquote big following, I mean, just try it. You get to set the terms. And I think we forget that so much, which means it invites people that because they don't have boundaries, they expect you to not have boundaries. But you say, actually, no, there is a way that we operate here. And if you don't like it, you don't have to engage, but I invite you to stay even if you don't like it, but you just have to be respectful. So I think that's a good approach.
Respect is absolutely everything, because people are going to receive what you have to say so much better if you just say, hey, I disagree because of this in a respectful way, for sure. Or just moving on and sharing what you're passionate about and being the one to put it out into the world. Oh, we talked about so many good things. I am a little nervous, just to be fully transparent, of how it's going to be received by sharing my experience, because like you said, of the way the whole identity politics, the way of that, even though I feel confident in my stance and I feel confident in what I've looked into and what my friends' experiences and what, me just sharing my experience alone is just, it's a delicate situation, but I'm excited at the same time because I find this topic so fascinating. I find listening to the layers and trying to understand the nuance and the heart of like how we can really move forward as a collective and in a positive way. So I guess my last question to you would be like, what do you think could happen if we stopped self-censoring as a collective and stopped self-sabotaging and became really in tune on a large level? Obviously that doesn't mean everybody, but on a large level, if we really tapped into that, to like really listening to each other and just trying to understand where we're coming from, and like let go of these obsession with identity politics and things like that, like where could we go forward? Where would it take us with like victor mentality?
That's such a beautiful question. Even as you were talking, I could just feel sort of like my shoulders just relaxing at the idea of us just not being absolute vicious animals to each other. And here's the thing, if I'm being totally honest, and I'm a very hopeful person, I think some things are just hardwired in us as primal beings, in terms of how we sort of just flock to tribalism and we want to find our groups and we want to, I think some things are sort of hardwired within us. So I don't think there'll ever be, not necessarily a utopia, but maybe even something before that. I don't think we'll ever get to that level of just cohesion and understanding, etc. But I do think that if we manage, which I think we can, to just pull ourselves away from these extremes and just find our way back to the middle, I think it will just be much easier to coexist. I think it will just be much easier to actually understand each other. I think we can come to a point where we recognize our differences, but we're not threatened by our differences. I think we could come to a point of being curious about what makes us similar, because we are so similar. we seem to think that everything that is happening right now, for example, we're the first to ever experience this. You know, I'm sure so many times over the course of, let's say, 100, 200, 300 years, the people then thought that they would be the last civilization to exist because of the intensity of what was happening. And I think we're just experiencing our part of that, where things just become so shocking and so unavoidable. But we can get through it. We can get through it. I don't think it's going to be perfect, but I think even just the fact that you and I, Ellen, can sit here today after everything that happened in 2020, you as a white woman, although I shouldn't assume your race. According to the ideology, this is where you shout at me for assuming.
Don't be a bigot, Africa.
The fact that we can even have this conversation, to me, is a big sign. It's a big sign that something is shifting. And I think that's what it's going to look like. It's just conversation after conversation. And then the amount of people that listen to this, they carry the conversation into their own lives, even if they just get the courage to share it on their story and they never normally wouldn't. That's playing a part in us unraveling this. So I think it's already happening. I
I do too. Especially a lot of the places that I'm, listening to and seeing that people are being more aware, I think, or just open to different ideas.
Yeah.
And I think maybe before social media, like a decade ago, it didn't feel so divisive, but maybe, right? Yeah, to me it didn't, at least. Maybe that's not everybody's experience, but then social media created such a huge divide. And if we could, and I think we are a little bit now, seeing how easily it has become divided, that maybe we can start to just come a little bit more together. I think the way you worded that was so beautiful, being coexisting together.
Right.
Completely.
Right. Yeah. And I'd love to know from you, and would you say you're hopeful when you sort of see everything that is happening, and just even from your own very personal experiences of something like 2020, would you say you're hopeful or something else?
Yeah, I definitely feel hopeful. I feel like I'm generally a positive person, and I like to see the good. And it just feels good inside to be speaking on these things that feel good to me. And as long as I'm doing what feels right in my own body and mind, that helps me to be in a good headspace, and then just seeing the world in a positive way. And yes. I do think I think things are continually getting better. But then when I talk to some people, they're like, no, it's not. And I'm like,
I know.
I could see both sides, but I'm generally hopeful. I am, yes. What about you?
I'm with you. I'm right there with you. That's why I have this huge smile, because anyway, I'm always smiling and laughing. The world could be burning and I'll just be laughing. But I'm hopeful. And I cannot wait to share this conversation and to just create more conversation. And I'm doing a lot of research right now, actually, just understanding the psychology of some of the things that were spoken about. So maybe we can come together in a year or something, or less, and do a part 2, so I can just share some of these findings with you.
Oh, that would be so fun. Or we could even tackle a different topic. Because honestly, we could do this same type of topic too and see where we're at a year from now. But also, I feel like you generally get a sense of like when you disagree with someone on a certain thing that like, oh, that would be such a good conversation. I just feel it, because it would be positive, respectful, friendly. Like, we should figure out what we disagree about, and then we should have that conversation.
That would be so much fun. I'm in.
Okay, we'll plan it. We'll do some digging and figure out where we... For sure. Oh, this was such a good conversation. I'm so thankful for you coming on, and I just appreciate everything you're sharing. It's so helpful, I think, for so many people to listen and just soak in and just realize that your mind is so powerful, and your addiction story is incredible. I know we didn't get too much into it. You explained in the beginning some of it, but I encourage anyone to go listen to any of her podcasts that she's been interviewed on, or even on her own podcasts, and it's an incredible story. So you're very inspiring, and I just appreciate you coming on.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I had sifted through the conversations that you've had before and everything you share, and I knew that this would be such a rich exchange, but I I feel so recharged and light, and it's just flown by. It doesn't feel like however long it's been at all. And I just admire your courage as well. And you said earlier that you feel a little bit nervous, and I still sometimes feel a little bit nervous depending on what I'm talking about. And I think those nerves are useful because they show you that you're doing something that you care about. They remind you of your integrity as well, because it means that even though you're feeling those sort of uncomfortable feelings, you're still moving through it because you know this is the right thing to do. So I can only admire that. Thank you.
Oh, wow. That's such a good way to put it. It's so true. It means that you're really doing something. Like when you have those nerves, you're about to do something big or something you really want to do, even if it's small. It could be something small, but you really need to do it in your heart. Yes, that's such a good way to say it.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Africa. Okay, lastly, though, I'm trying to think, you know how we're going when you're talking about writing a post and you're thinking, okay, what are people going to say? What's the thing that people are going to say, and how can I shift this and word this differently? Or how am I just aware of how people are going to respond? Because I think you and I, our brain kind of works similar in that way, because I see the way that you post and I'm like, yes, I would so say it that way type of thing.
Yes.
But the one thing, or maybe not the one, but maybe a criticism I do see happening from this conversation towards me would be, Ellen, you're tokening Africa. How are you not going to have on someone else with the stance that you disagree with about like wokeness, BLM, all these types of things? Right. And I hate, honestly, I think the word tokening is disgusting to me, and mass majority of the time that is not the case. And the assumptions, I know I'm jumping back into our conversation that was just about to end, but it reminds me I'm like, well, just a couple more minutes, because it reminds me of certain things that like even my personal experience of that being labeled, you're tokening someone, when it's like so far from the truth. Like an example would be like, I posted a picture once on Thanksgiving of my friends, and I was like, I'm so thankful for my friends, and we were all together. Not all of us, it was some of my friends. Some people were still missing. And in the comments, it was like, some people, obviously not everybody. There's so many loving, kind people out there. Most people are loving and kind. It's just the harsh responses can seem louder in your brain.
Yes.
But something would say, you have, or why are all your friends white? You have too many white friends. And to when I replied, well, actually, 2 of the girls in this picture are Mexican. And then they say, oh, you're tokening them. And I'm like, what? No. What? You're the one who pointed out the color. And so I was just responding to you. And that's a place that we're in right now that I think is so unhealthy, this obsession. And Zuby talked about that too, that he's like, I get all the time, people be like, why do you have so many white friends? He's like, I live in Britain, where most people are white. Like, what do you want me to do?
And you know what? Actually, I do think this is an important piece of all of this, because I don't imagine people would, for example, send me a message and tell me that I am, tokening myself. It would be likely to be the other way around. But what that implies as well, the reason why this is actually racist in itself, is that it implies that I am incapable of making a decision for myself that I want to engage in this conversation. That it plays into that whole power dynamic obsession, that somehow you have this power dynamic that you get to just pick any person of color, quote unquote, and you can just use them for your own very personal agenda. Not that I have something very important and nuanced to say, and that this is the work that I do, and I'm looking at something that is happening culturally, and we align on a lot of our values, so we're having a conversation that is important. It can't just be that objective and true and simple. It has to be some sinister thing that confirms that I'm in a powerless position and you're weaponizing your supposed power.
It's disgusting. It's so disgusting. It's actually, it's assuming that I'm not having you on because I actually think what you have to say is fascinating and intellectual and just emotional and very emotional to me and impactful to me. It's assuming that I'm having you on because of the color of your skin, and that you are powerless in your ability to detect if somebody is tokening you or not. It's a dig at you. It's actually more a dig at you. It's actually just disgusting to me.
So I am glad that you brought that up. I am glad that you brought that up, because I don't think, to be honest, I've never heard two people that are sort of, just in terms of identity, are pinned against each other. I've never really had that very short and simple exchange happen publicly. And I think it will snap a lot of people maybe out of their own judgments that maybe they didn't realize were lurking.
Yes.
I can't wait for a part 2 with you.
Oh my gosh, we have to do it. We're putting a pin in it. And maybe one day you can come to Hawaii.
Oh, I would love to.
Oh my gosh.
I'm going to be in the US next year, probably in the first 4 months of the year. So I will come and visit you.
Oh my gosh, that'll make my year. I'll be so excited if you come. Okay, we're gonna plan it. Stay tuned for part 2, everybody. In-person interview. Wow, this is amazing. Thank you, Africa.
Thank you, my love. Thank you.
I can't wait to share this. All right, bye everyone. Thanks for joining.